I think my grandfather might be a cat. No, wait, hear me out. He loves tuna. He's constantly knocking things off the counter. There was one time I walked in on him licking himself clean. And he has 9 lives. Seriously, that man can't die. First, he's a war veteran. After his service, he was on a boat that just conveniently exploded, swimming to safety without issue. Later in life, he canceled a flight last minute, finding out the day after it crashed. He also once decided to contribute to solving New Jersey's deer overpopulation problem by smashing into one with his motorcycle, walking away unscathed because his fall was broken by a container of dental floss in his pocket. But there was one near-death experience that was a little different. And he was diagnosed with ALS and told he had 2 months to live. A misdiagnosis, thank God. But something about that experience really affected him. He was forced to come to terms with his mortality. The thing is, he's not unique. It's something that everybody has to do eventually, but it seems like we want to avoid thinking about it as much as possible, portraying death as this great evil, and thus ignoring it. Now, don't get me wrong. Death can certainly be tragic, but it often isn't. And I fear author Lawrence R. Samuel was right when he said that our fear of death is so great that it lies buried deep within our subconscious. So today, let's first scratch at how we deal with mortality. Then, we'll pounce on the effects of our unhealthy attitude before finally finding a perfect solution. It makes sense why death is scary. We have no control over it. We don't know how or when it'll happen, just that it will. Dr. David Sanfilippo, a health studies professor, states that death is viewed as an encroachment on life instead of part of it. Logically, this makes sense. Living is good. Dying is bad. It's like taxes. Don't think about it too hard until a man in a black suit comes knocking at your door. Professor Alan Calla here, however, argues that this mentality has made our society death-denying. And looking around, he's right. Take Halloween. What was once a holiday to celebrate dead saints has been reduced for a way for children to collect candy and parents to collect dental bills. Practically every single religion has some notion of life after death. And with aging, look, vanity is one thing. But when tech billionaire Brian Johnson swaps blood with his son to look young, you have to wonder, are we going too far with this? A CBS poll found that more than half of Americans don't think about death at all. But why? It's one of the few universal human experiences. But yet, psychologist Ernest Becker argues that the majority of human actions are taken as a means to evade or ignore death. This means that when it does eventually happen, it hits hard. Just take a look at somebody like Queen Elizabeth. Super great leader, unless you're Irish, or Kenyan, or Princess Diana. When the Queen died, the world wept. She was 96 years old. What's so shocking about a 96-year-old dying? And the thing is, this disposition towards death isn't limited to royalty. And because we make it to be such an evil, we end up actively ignoring one of the most important parts of our lives. Our unhealthy relationship with mortality is more than just a convoluted coping mechanism, though. Ignoring it begets pain and stress for the ones that have to deal with it. In the 1990s, Canadian activist Sue Rodriguez was diagnosed with ALS. Knowing her fate and not wanting to see herself waste away, she sought a physician to end her life. But euthanasia was illegal. She pleaded to the government for an exemption, arguing, if I cannot consent to my death, whose body is this? Who owns my life? She lost the case 5-4. Sue died 2 years later, in pain, in vain. Our aversion to death only causes years of suffering for people like Sue. And in a country where only 10 of 50 states have legalized euthanasia, this problem still plagues our nation. But this issue isn't limited to such extremes. Take, for example, writer Sophia Lorenzi. When her father died in 2018, she was suddenly plunged into a world of incomprehensible jargon. In the 5 days between his death and funeral, she had to decipher the difference between a coffin and a casket, an heir or a beneficiary. whether to inter or intern her father's ashes. But that marked just the beginning of the 2 years it took her to get her father's affairs in order. All while still in shock. All while still grieving. And she isn't alone. Less than half of Americans over the age of 55 even have a will. Fewer than a third have an advance directive for end-of-life care. And only 7% have pre-planned the funerals. So I ask, why ignore death when doing so only hurts the ones we love? When you die, who's going to be the one to pick up the pieces? I had to answer all these questions and more when, in 2019, my mother got seriously sick. Death suddenly became so real. For the first time in my life, I had to consider the possibility of losing someone I love. I wished for more time. I wished I could have said I love you more often. I wished I could have been a better son. I realized that up until that point, I had lived my entire life like she was immortal, like I had unlimited interactions with her. I had treated it like she was always going to be there, and I realized far too late that I had failed to maximize the time I had with her. Now, fortunately, she recovered, but I am ashamed to say that it took me until she was on her deathbed to realize that I had taken her life for granted. And the thing is, it's not just me. Bronnie Ware, a palliative care nurse, spent years caring for people on their deathbeds. In moments of clarity, her patients expressed regrets. Regrets of not living life to its fullest. Regrets of living a life of stress instead of one of happiness. In the end, people tend to realize that they've been living wrong. And I think it's time we stop waiting till it's too late to appreciate the life we have. So, let's start from square one. Death is unavoidable, but we shouldn't avoid it. In fact, I think we need to do the exact opposite. As psychotherapist Joe Nash states, coming to terms with death is essential to living life fully. So, let's first replace our apprehension with appreciation. Appreciate our finite beings. Appreciate the fragility of life. That aging is a privilege. Palliative care expert Joanna Petz states that simply openly talking about death is enough to reduce the anxieties associated with it. And we need to do this so that we can learn to cherish every moment and make every one of them count. Next, let's plan for after we're gone, because there's no reason why we should burden our loved ones with logistics while they're grieving. So, as soon as possible, write your will, arrange your funeral, and get your affairs in order so that your family won't have to. And finally, build a legacy, because the impact we make lasts far longer than we do. And the cool part is, according to psychologist Tom Pizzinski, knowing that you made the world a better place makes dying significantly easier. And it doesn't have to be this grandiose thing either. Take, for example, Mittens. Grandpa. Sure, he might have avoided death around 30 million times, but he's also a veteran. He served his country and built a family from love. He might not have changed the world, but he sure made it brighter. And that's the gist of it. It doesn't have to be anything too special, but when we can start living not just for ourselves, but for others too, we can make a lasting and fulfilling impact. Death doula Aula Arthur puts it perfectly. Our death might create the period at the end of the sentence, but it is that period that makes it a sentence at all. So let's make every word count. And let's start today. What are we waiting for anyway? Death?